Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our peers and partners in the housing and racial justice movements. This is the latest installment of our communication series, Having Tough Conversations with Reporters, hosted in partnership with M+R Communications. Today's training is a part of Shift the Bay, which is a coalition-driven initiative to advance research-driven and field practice strategies, tactics, and messages that drive new narratives for the housing and racial justice movement in the Bay Area. My name is Madison Roberts, and I'm the narrative specialist at NPH, Shift the Bay's proud anchor organization. You can learn more about the initiative, its resources, newsletter, events, and our amazing Slack community at shiftthebay.org. M+R has supported 3 Shift the Bay trainings over the past few months, focusing on media relations, best practices in August, opinion pieces in October, and on media interviews in November, all through a Shift the Narrative lens. So today we're going to explore tactics which correct and constructively improve a reporter's news coverage. As we work to shift the narrative on housing in the Bay Area, learning how to successfully navigate tricky and tough conversations with reporters will always be a part of our work, especially if we're working on creating a strong media presence or boosting the visibility for our organization. This training will focus on growing that reporter-advocate relationship without damaging it. We know that by expanding this coalition's collective skill and strategy with media relations and social media, we'll have more power shifting the narrative and conversations in the region. As we get into the presentation today, I invite you to think really critically about the practical application of today's session and how it might shift your media approach and or the long-term narratives we're working to amplify. But you definitely will not have to answer those questions alone. I am stoked to introduce you all to our presenters from M+R today, Rosa and Rebecca. They have an incredible program in store for y'all today. We're also super lucky to have Lou Hansen from Bay Area News Group, Mercury News, as a panelist later on to support today's Q&A session. If you haven't done so, please mute yourself and feel free to turn off your video for the first half of the session, but do introduce yourself in the chat box. We have dozens of organizers, communications staff, policy professionals, affordable housing developers. Tell us who you are and what brings you here today. I'm really excited to be here, and I really encourage you all to use the chat box to share reactions, feedback, ideas, and just connect during today's session too. With that, I will turn it over to Rosa to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madison, and welcome everyone. My name is Rosa and I use she, her pronouns. And like Madison said, I am joined today by my colleagues, Rebecca and Dan, who is running the slide deck. If you are just joining us now, please make sure and drop your name, pronouns, and the organization that you are with in the chat. And now I want to quickly go over the agenda for today's training. So this will be an hour-long training structured in 2 different parts. The first right now is a presentation on tactics for having productive, tough conversations with reporters. You can see here the main topics that we'll be covering in the presentation. And as Madison mentioned, the second half of today's training will be a conversation with Lou Hansen, a housing reporter at the Bay Area News Group who is based at the Mercury News. And we will introduce him in more detail when he joins us around 12:30. Just a few important notes about today's training. I do want to clarify, I know the training was advertised in some places from 12 to 1:30, but we will be ending at 1. The first part of the training will be recorded and published on the Shift the Bay website for reference, and we will also be sharing the slide deck after the training concludes. The conversation with Lou will not be shared. You're welcome to keep your cameras off for the first half of the hour. But after that, if you're in a position to do so, we would appreciate if you could be camera on, just so we can have a more interactive conversation with Lou. I will warn you, we do have a lot of content to get through in the next 20 or so minutes. So we won't read through the information on every slide, but like I said, you will receive the slide deck afterwards, and you'll also have our contact information should you have any questions. We will be mentioning a couple different resources during today's training, and our colleague Dan will be dropping those links into the chat. Now I will turn it over to my colleague Rebecca to talk about the goals of the Shift the Bay initiative.
Thanks, Rosa. So before we dive into the specifics of having tough conversations, we want to back up and think big picture about what we're trying to accomplish broadly with media coverage. So if you attended November's training, this content will look familiar. We're highlighting it because we think it's really important to understand big picture before we get into the granular of reporter conversations. Our overall goal at Shift the Bay is to elevate the conversation around housing in ways that prioritize racial equity and highlight the challenges faced by renters across the Bay Area. So the information and narrative shifts on this slide is from the Shift the Bay Quick Reference Messaging Guide, which is a really helpful resource. It talks about what to say when talking about housing justice, homelessness, gentrification, homeowners versus renters, and evictions and tenant protections. So Dan is going to drop this link in the chat, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it, bookmark it, and use it as a reference tool. Thank you, Dan. And so now we've talked about, on the next slide, what our goals are. So now we can talk about how we accomplish them. There are a lot of ways to accomplish these goals. So in past trainings, we've talked about overall media relations best practices and how to successfully use opinion pieces to advance that work. Media interviews can also help us achieve our narrative shift goals by pushing back on dominant narratives that we see in the press. So for example, if we are seeing a lot of stories that say that housing affordability struggles are inevitable in the Bay Area, or housing affordability is an individual responsibility, then we want to reach out to reporters to offer a different perspective and share storytellers or experts who can help to reframe that way of thinking. And interviews also help us to build relationships with reporters. And that means hopefully they'll start to see you or your organization as a resource when working on future stories. And the most important thing to know about having tough conversations, sorry, on the next slide, with reporters is that the most successful conversations happen after you've already built a successful, trusting relationship with the reporter in question. So to that end, we do want to reiterate some best practices for engaging with reporters before you even reach out about a correction or another difficult topic. So every reporter does things a little bit differently, and different media markets might operate differently. But from our collective experience at M+R, these are some of our best practices that we've picked up in engaging with reporters. So journalists are usually on deadlines, so getting back to them in a timely manner is always appreciated. And it's also nice to engage with the reporter stories in an authentic way. So whether that's mentioning them or complimenting a story that they've written, that can really go a long way, whether that's on social media or via email. And something that we do a lot when we see a relevant story to an issue area that we're working on by a reporter we don't have a relationship with yet is that we'll reach out and thank them for the story, thank them for paying attention to this important issue, and then offer our clients as a resource for any future stories. So you can also connect them with other organizations as well. And you don't always have to be pitching an angle, you can just be building these relationships. So now I'll hand it back over to Rosa to talk about what having these tough conversations might look like.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So you may have been wondering over the last few minutes what exactly we mean by tough conversations. So let's get into it. On the next slide, you will see that typically these conversations fall into two different buckets: corrections and retractions, and improvements. And I just want to back up for a moment and explain that we use the word tough in this training because we know that bringing these things up to reporters can be stressful and intimidating for some people. And we also hope that by the end of today's training that you feel more equipped to take on these conversations going forward, and that the prospect of doing so isn't as intimidating as you may have thought. So you're probably most familiar with corrections and retractions, and we'll show examples of those in a moment. Today, we'll also be talking about improvements, which really can play a crucial role in our shift the narrative work. So a few different examples of improvements could include asking the reporter to change the language that they're using, and we'll include an example of this later in the training. I will note that this may not necessarily be an ask to change language for the story in question, but more of a gentle encouragement to be aware of more appropriate or up-to-date language to use for the future. Another example of an improvement could include highlighting people and perspectives that the reporter may not have known to include. Others include explaining how some types of reporting can be damaging to people. And then probably the most common here is just sending information that you should have included as a follow-up to your interview. Ideally, this would happen immediately after the interview, but maybe you forgot, or the article came out earlier than you expected, or you just didn't think of a certain resource until you saw the article. So with this type of outreach, recognize that it probably won't change the content of the article that's already been published, but it can serve as a really helpful resource for the reporter going forward. And maybe they'll add a note to the bottom of their story, or post a tweet linking to the information that you've sent, or ask their outlet to share it on social media, especially if it's a resource that directly helps people. So an example of this might be rent relief application resources for tenants. An outlet would definitely be interested in including that in their story if it wasn't there already. I will now pass it back to Rebecca to go over some examples of corrections and retractions in the media and explain which scenarios do and don't warrant asking for corrections.
Thanks, Rosa. So as Rosa just mentioned, there is a difference between corrections and retractions. Corrections are when a media outlet adjusts an inaccurate factual error, but that error didn't take away from the main point or framing of the article. And media outlets have different processes for how they handle and communicate out corrections. So, don't assume that because something was handled one way at one outlet, it'll be identical at another. And here is an example of what a correction can look like. I'm sure, most of you are familiar, but this image is a correction that the New York Times issued that just corrects a geographical inaccuracy, but it being wrong did not take away from the story. And on the next slide, we'll go over retractions. So retractions are when a media outlet fully takes back what they wrote because it was more than something like a grammatical error. They might take back a full story, they might take back just pieces of it. And this image is of a retraction from the Washington Post, which had to correct more major parts of a news story due to inaccurate information. And next, before we get into the specifics of how to approach these types of conversations, sorry, on the next slide, let's go over the different types of scenarios that necessitate these types of conversations and the scenarios that don't. So one scenario is that there is a factual error and you can provide a source for the correct fact. One way to avoid an error on your end during an interview is to not guess on any stats in the moment. So if you're unsure of any data, just let the reporter know that you want to confirm the information and that you'll follow up right after your conversation. You might also find that you or someone at your organization was misquoted. And we also want to note that you should always try to record your media interviews, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute. But during the interview, if you feel like something you've said was confusing or it's a little complicated, you can ask reporters to sort of repeat back what you've just said or explain how they understood it. And something that we recommend that you use very sparingly is after the interview, you could ask to review the quotes that will be attributed to you, but not all reporters are going to have the time for this. So that's why we just don't recommend it very often. And if there is a misspelling, incorrect title, or a wrong description, you should also ask to correct that. So what may seem like a minor error can still be pretty important. If an error remains published online, it can be used as a source for future news articles. So it's just best to correct that. And the last situation that will warrant a correction is if the reporter included something that was supposed to be off the record. That is a unique situation that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So on the next slide, we'll talk about if you need to approach a reporter with a correction, and we do have a few tips on how to go about doing that. So the first is to avoid assigning blame to the reporter outright. Maybe this was the fault of a copy editor who picked up on the wrong detail, or the reporter had filed 5 stories that day and missed correcting one small thing. Reporters are just people. So, we really recommend starting from a kind and understanding perspective. With most people, this approach will get you much further than aggression or blame. And you can also politely point out the error, provide the reporter with the correct information, and then ask them to run a correction. So don't come right out of the gate demanding a correction that's unlikely to get you the result that you want and could actually end up doing more long-term damage to your press relationships than any short-term damage that would be caused by a factual error in an article. And there is a difference between, being firm and being rude. You do want to be firm and clear in your ask, but you could do so politely. And we also do want to note that if it's more of a substantive correction, be prepared and available to workshop language with an editor to help them get it right. They'll most likely want to figure that out immediately after you email them. So just be prepared for that. And on the next slide, there's also going to be situations that don't warrant asking for a correction. So we'll get into that now. In every interview, you're opening yourself up to stories being framed in a different way than how you anticipated or wanted. So just be aware of that heading into an interview and know that. You may not like how your quote is perceived in an article, or you take issue with how your organization is being portrayed. You may not like the tone of the article, or the reporter didn't use any or all of the information you provided. These scenarios don't warrant asking for a correction. However, after a news story comes out and you genuinely feel like not correcting a story would be detrimental to your mission or your organization's goal, then an option would be to submit a letter to the editor that shares more of the way that you perceive an issue. And if you genuinely found that the way that the story was framed was harmful, then you can make an internal decision that'll stay private with yourself, that you're just not going to approach this reporter anymore for a story. And then just to quickly go over off the record conversations. Most conversations you have with a reporter will be on the record, and so we don't usually suggest off the record conversations unless you truly have a close relationship with a reporter. A rule of thumb that we like to tell people about interviews in general is don't say anything in an interview that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the New York Times. And you should assume that you're on the record all the time, unless there's a very explicit agreement beforehand that you're not. If a reporter prints something that you discussed while speaking off the record, which should have been talked about and agreed upon before an interview, you have limited options for next steps once that story is published and out there and your name is in it. So that is why we don't usually recommend speaking off the record. But if you do find yourself in a situation like this, we recommend you follow up with the reporter and explain how you understood the conversation to be off the record. And eventually, if needed, you can reach out to the editor or publisher to step in. And one thing we would suggest that you don't do is write an LTE or an op-ed attacking the journalist. It can get pretty complicated when you get into off the record territory. So we really encourage you to just pretend like every conversation you have is on the record. And now Rosa will get into how to record your interviews.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we wanted to touch on this because it's really important. Always make sure that you're recording your entire media interview, no matter how small the outlet is. Even if you think you won't get quoted in the story, even if it's a reporter that you've worked with for years and have a trusting relationship with, recording your interview just means that you're doing your own due diligence and working with the media. We do really want to highlight here that California is an all-party recording consent state, which means that all parties to any confidential conversations must give their consent to be recorded. So this just means that before you start recording, you'll need to ask the reporter if it's okay that you record the conversation for your own internal purposes. And Dan is going to drop a link in the chat here with more information about that. Thanks, Dan. So a few reasons why you want to record the conversation. One is that it helps you know if you said anything that you need to clarify or correct before the story is published. And then you have an audio file to back yourself up if there's a disagreement about what was said. It helps you grab sound bites or quotes from your interview that you can use in future interviews for website content or any other needs that you may have. Listening back to interviews later can be a really helpful tool for figuring out how to further define your message and work on your own interview skills. I know it can sound probably pretty terrifying to listen back to an interview of yourself, but we promise it's a really good tool. And then another reason to record is that it's a really helpful resource for understanding different reporter interview styles. And then once you have an audio file, it can become a resource that you can share with colleagues down the line if they're preparing to do an interview with a reporter that they're unfamiliar with. Just a few tips to go over on recording interviews. There's many different ways to record yourself depending on how the conversation is happening, your phone, a computer program, someone else's phone. But whichever recording program you use, just make sure to test it beforehand and verify that the audio is clear, because the last thing that you want is an unusable audio recording of the interview. One thing I will note is that if you've done a big interview, like a profile piece or a spotlight on an issue campaign, consider generating a transcript of the interview ahead of time. There's tools that will do this for you, so you don't have to do it by hand, but that again can really help in understanding if there's anything that you need to clarify or correct before the piece goes up. And then the last tip is just to keep your media interviews organized in a tracker. This might seem super particular, but even if you don't do a ton of interviews, we really recommend keeping everything organized in one place, using the same naming convention, and just making things easier on yourself in the future. So on the next slide, you'll see just an example of a media tracker that you can use. And again, you will receive the slide deck after this presentation, so you're welcome to use that as a template. And now we're going to go through some examples of communicating corrections and improvements to reporters. I know we're coming up on the 12:30 mark, and we don't want to cut too much into our conversation with Lou. So I'll probably go through this a little bit faster than might be preferred. But again, you'll have the slide deck at the end, and our team's also available for any questions. So on the next slide, you will just see, sorry, thank you, Dan. So in this slide, you'll see a template example of asking a reporter to make a minor correction, pretty straightforward. And again, you're welcome to use this as a template. On the next slide, you will see an example from one of our colleagues at M+R that we think is really helpful. And this was from someone who was asking a journalist to write about, a journalist who writes about people in prison to reconsider using words like inmate. So there's a few different things we really like about this example. The first is that there's no blame here. The writer uses very soft touch language saying, I did want to mention one thing though, but they don't use the word you or make it feel like a personal attack on this particular reporter. Instead, they say, we try to advise journalists, which makes it a little bit more impersonal and likely better received. But the best thing about this example is that there's a lot of external sources here. So the writer doesn't presume to know best and just give a recommendation and leave it at that. She provides the reporter with ample information to learn more about this particular language ask. So we really like this example. And then on the next slide, you will see an example from this past fall where we felt that a reporter's story could be improved by linking to a resource that we had recently shared with them. One thing I will note about this particular situation is that the reporter didn't end up changing their story to include the resource, and that's pretty normal. You're not always going to get the response or the change that you want, but it is better to put the ask out there, provided that you're doing so occasionally and not every single week. So this is the end of the formal training, and I will turn it to Rebecca to take a few questions. I see we're getting some questions in the chat.
Yeah,